I'm Mark Westgarth. I'm an Associate Professor of Art History and Museum Studies at the University of Leeds. And I should say that I'm speaking on behalf of the Bows here. We'd like to thank Arts Council England for supporting the project, and also Howell Film for doing all the filming support. And I'm going to introduce the panel. Matthew Reed, right at the end of the desk there, is an independent conservator and has worked with the Bows Museum since 2008. He previously worked as assistant curator and conservator at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, and has worked for the National Trust and the Museum of History of Science in Oxford. Next to him is Seth Kennedy, who's an independent horologist who specialises in the repair and restoration of antique pocket watches, both the mechanisms and their cases, and much of his work is carried out using traditional tools and techniques, and he is a Quest Scholar, Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Trust. Next to Seth is Darrell Sarderson, who is works as a clock conservator in West Sussex, both as a freelancer and as part of the team for J.E. Alnett and Son in Midhurst. He has an MA in Conservation Studies from Westdean College, and also now teaches at Westdean. And next to Dale is Daniella Corda, Horology and Scientific Instruments Conservator at Royal Museums Greenwich. Her current position involves the care of the working collection, which includes the Harrison C clocks and the Greenwich Time Ball. And next to Daniella is David Rooney, a writer and museum curator. He was formerly curator of timekeeping at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich and keeper of technologies and engineering at the Science Museum in London. And directly to my left is Anna Rolls, who is curator of the Clockmakers Museum and Archive and is based at the Science Museum in London. She previously worked at the Royal Museum Greenwich and trained with the British Horological Institute and holds a master's degree in conservation studies, also from Westdean. And so I'm going to ask Matthew if he can just say a few words about the project by way of introduction. Matthew.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So this project had its genesis back in 2008. In 2008 was the first time the Swan automaton had been fully disassembled in over 40 years. That project in 2008 was conservation-led, so as we conservators know, that involves not only disassembly, washing, reassembly and lubrication, but also photographing and recording every single component of the mechanism, which is 700 major components, excluding screws and fixings. Now, that project raised a few, if not several, significant areas of interest in relation to the ongoing operation and display and interpretation of the object. So over these last 10 years, we've been developing those ideas, and this week, this knowledge exchange and information exchange is really the next step in that process of widening the dialogue to include the panel that you've just heard.
We'll take I'll present the first question, if I may. What issues have you discovered with the Swan during the investigation so far? And I'd like to put that to Dale, if possible.
In front of me here, I've got the brain of the Swan, basically. This is the multifunction cam. It's got various cams on it fixed around this central drum, and it controls all of the motion of the Swan's neck and head and beak, and the fish in its mouth as well. And I'm not going to touch it because I'm not wearing gloves, but I will just point out a couple of bits for you to see. Here we've got this is what we call the fish fight cam. So when the Swan catches the fish, this is what basically makes the fish waggle about in its mouth like it's trying to get free. And then for anyone that doesn't know, the illusion of the Swan catching the fish is actually done. The fish is always in the back of the Swan's throat, and it shoots out to look like it's been caught. And that action is controlled by this cam here. So this is the fish ejection cam. Behind it, we've got the preening cam, which controls the lower jaw action of the swan. So when it's preening its feathers and fighting with the fish, anytime it's moving its jaw, that's being done by this cam here. And then this track around the central drum, this is the main thing that I want to kind of focus on in terms of issues that we've come across, which this is something that was originally identified by Matthew in 2008, and more work has been done on it since, and we've been examining it today. This track controls the rotation of the swan's neck, and because of the geometry of how the neck is moved by the sector that engages with this track, the issue that was obviously come across the last time any major restoration work was carried out on the swan back in 1968 to 1972, there was obviously issues with the sector engaging, and in order to get the rotation, the full sort of 360-degree rotation of the neck, this track had to be widened, and we can see a lot of sections on here that are hanging out over the central drum, and we know that these sections are later because they've got 20th century BA screws in them, and then there are various empty holes with 18th century screw threads in them, so that we know that this track is not the original track, for want of a better word, and that's not necessarily a problem in and of itself, but the problem that's caused by it being wider than the central drum is that this track tends to knock, catch, jam up on the levers, the followers for the external cams that are external to the drum, and that can cause the swan to stop working. It's causing additional wear to those followers, and going back to these two, the fish fight and the fish ejection cam, we actually, after more conversation today and observation, we think that originally this was one cam, which was then transmitted its action to one follower, and the follower has been modified with a new section added to it, and this cam has been split and stepped, and that's because of this issue with the wider track, where the track overhangs quite a long way from the drum here, and that was obviously catching on the cam follower, so they've moved this out here so that the follower can be further away from the central drum. So there's quite a lot of issues there with the brain.
Thank you, Dale. Could I ask the same question to you, Anna, about the issues that you've discovered in your investigation?
Sure. I think the brains of the swan is what Dale's just looked at, but there's so many other areas that have issues, inherent issues with them, namely the fragility of the swan and how it operates. And one of the things in particular is its neck, and the fact that we have all these silver rings that are overlaid over each other, and they are work hardened, and as a result very, very fragile and prone to cracking. And Matthew had noticed in the previous restoration in 2008 that he had tried to minimize the problem with tarnishing that was happening on the neck, which if you have seen the swan, you might notice that the body is much brighter and much more silver in colour than the neck, which is much darker. And that's because no lacquer has been possible to put on the neck to keep it looking bright and silver. And Matthew tried to resolve that by adding a layer to stop the tarnish from happening, but that only had the effect of jamming up the swan's neck, because that extra layer was enough to kind of cause an interference between the two, all the levels of silver. So it's one of these things where you address one problem and you can introduce new problems, and this happens all the way through the swan and its mechanism. And there are so many things that we could talk about, but we haven't got time this evening, so I'm just really highlighting that one as an example, and we'll crack on with the next question.
So thank you, Anna. So our next question kind of moves us beyond the kind of investigation of the swan in terms of your experience of dismantling it, and more to do with what we do with automaton in museums. So what do you think are the boundaries and challenges when conserving automatons such as the Swan? And I'm going to address that one to Matthew.
Thank you, Mark. I understand the question relates specifically to automatons, so I will deal with them. But of course, the boundaries and challenges in the broader conservation sense are the same that they are for every single object, and that is broadly a risk assessment exercise, and it's also cost-benefit. And I use the word cost and I use the word benefit in the very widest sense. However, with automaton, in order to understand the question or to answer the question, one has to understand what you're actually trying to preserve or conserve. And that with automaton, I guess most people would say, is automatic action of a lifelike device. So we deconstruct that to something that's dynamic. So to answer the question, Mark, how do you maintain or preserve or conserve or whatever you want to call it, the dynamic or the overtly dynamic nature of something when using it wears it out? So that's our question, and without avoiding the question, we say if we're going to take an action, let's just say for instance we replace a screw where the thread is damaged, we look at the widest possible cost of that in all senses of the word, and we look at the widest possible benefit of that, and then we make a decision in relation to another killer question, which is who are owners, who are stakeholders, and so on. So that is the broad thing in terms of preserving the dynamic function of the thing.
Thank you, Matthew. And could I address the same question to Daniella about the challenges, boundaries of conserving automata?
I think if we're looking backwards into the past, the boundaries are basically the records that we still have, if any, and clues within the object about its life up until now. So the Swan that we have behind us is full of clues, signatures, stamps, replaced parts, newer screws versus older screws. So there's material clues. But in terms of the Swan or automaton in general and the future of them, I don't think the boundaries are very few, if any, and there's so many directions that the Swan could go in terms of interpretation, restoration, curatorial interpretation, education, and it really depends on how and who makes those decisions. From the mechanical perspective, we can fashion whatever movement is required through various methods, some traditional, some modern. But if we don't know what we're aiming for, then we're at a standstill.
Thank you, Daniella. And Seth, could you tell us, from your perspective, about the challenges of conserving automata?
Well, the difficulty always is to determine how original you might want something to be, and also whether you retain the original old repairs, or do you redo those repairs? If those repairs have been done in a fairly ugly or inappropriate fashion, do you take those repairs out? I mean, some of the repairs on this would have been done in that period around 1970, and therefore they have some history to them, but they don't have the same history as the rest of the device. I mean, the brain that Dale was talking about that's in front of us, nowadays we could remake the complete thing as we think it may have been originally, and that would retain the original components, which would then never wear out because we would have a new brain in that we would think. So is the originality important in the way that the Swan or any automata, is the originality important in how it works and how it functions? or is that originality more important in terms of the actual componentry that's in there? It's always a balancing act with something that's antique and moves as to whether you do the minimum required in order to retain the original purpose and original components, yet make them work together to provide the function that it always had or was intended to have.
Thank you. And can I just remind our Zoom viewers that if you want to, do send us some questions in the chat function, and we'll address those shortly after 7 o'clock, we think. Another kind of broader question about the future of the Swan, I think. What do you think, and I'm going to address this to each of you in turn, if I might, but I'm going to ask David first. What do you think of the future of the Swan might look like? How do you envisage the future to look for it?
I think the future of this is remarkable. I mean, one idea that's bubbled up very consistently as I've been in just the last day seeing under the skin of this incredible device is that there's an emotional connection between people and that object. And the thing is, there's always been an emotional connection. That's been the purpose of that right back to 1773 or whenever it was first made. It was to evoke senses of awe and wonder, which are emotional senses. And I think the idea of senses is really significant as well. I've had in mind that it was a visual feast, but I had the privilege of pressing the button to start the musical box earlier today, which thrilled me. And of course it was a sound feast as well, and other senses too. There's a description of the Swan when it was first on display in James Cox's museum in the 1770s in London, where it was one of several automata like that. And the description was that visitors were faced with a riot of brilliance, movement, and sound. So for me, that means that this is about magic. And therefore, what might it be in the future? I think it's very interesting to think through what might the 21st century riot of brilliance, movement, and sound be with the Swan at its heart? What kind of magic could we make for the audiences around the world, not just for those who see it in the flesh, but can see it in other ways as well? There's all kinds of things that might mean. I mean, automata are associated with the birth of science fiction, with other literary ideas. They're associated with how people think about acting and the role of actors in theatrical performances. Music, I've already mentioned, but music is really powerful in these stories. So perhaps we make new music, we make new theatrical performances, new works of literature and art, which perform the Swan for new audiences in some new ways. This is just the start of what I hope will be a long and very fruitful conversation, a very positive conversation about what that might involve.
Thank you. And Matthew, how do you envisage the future of the Swan?
Well, of course, David has summarised it beautifully. I think my take on it is one from a conservation and training perspective. It's actually not Swan per se, but it's what Swan does and what Swan is and what it means. Just going back to the 2008 project, which a few people have discussed here, for me it was a revelation because we did that project, which is quite cutting edge, in front of a live audience. And it was the first time I really understood that sense of ownership from what we might call traditional or local audiences. My digital sort of experience over the past couple of years has really turned that around to international, national, local, regional and international audience. So I think that's kind of cool. Who we are playing Swan for, if we do in fact play it again, and really importantly, who can't get to Bowes Museum, who in fact might never see the Swan work, and how does it impact on their lives? So they're the kind of questions that I'm interested in. But back to the beginning of my response, education and training in conservation of dynamic objects, really important. And I'd like to use the Swan as a vehicle for training and for things like STEM. It's stretching the point a little bit. If you look inside your washing machine, you can see the same things that are inside the Swan to a degree. You've got levers, cams, energy, springs, you name it, they're in there. So I think it's a really cool device as well to use as an education training sort of vehicle.
Thank you, Matthew. And Daniella, from your perspective, how would you envisage the future of the Swan?
I think personally, with a background in craft and also conservation, it would be sad and a shame to stop the Swan and say, sorry, it's too fragile, we will never see the Swan perform its performance for us again. I think that would be a big shame. But because of my training in conservation and my understanding of the materials that the Swan is made of, I think we have to be quite careful with that. And I do feel that there is a sensitive way of still experiencing the Swan and everything that it does and everything that it shows us, all the senses. But how we do that has to be very carefully considered. But yeah, they're, involving digital technologies, there's mini computers, which I've experimented with while I was a student, to simulate movements. So that's one option. There's videos, there's lots of clever technologies out there to simulate what the Swan does. But there's also, like David was mentioning, involving all the senses, and it can be an experience that doesn't put all the pressure on the Swan and its screws and its fragile neck. And there's ways that we can show off the Swan without entirely putting all the pressure on the mechanism and just continuing to wind it up as we have been doing.
Thank you. And Dale, your perspective on the future?
Well, I think often with heritage objects in museums, when we talk about the future of them in conservation and restoration, inevitably we end up talking about the past, and we're always chasing to recreate some kind of conjectured previous state. And what I think the Swan presents potentially exciting opportunities for is to recognize that the Swan has changed its state many times. It's been displayed in various different ways. The movement that it was able to carry out has been different at different times, and what it's done has constantly changed. And rather than say this 20th century restoration is wrong, it's the wrong movement, or this movement at this time was a better movement, why don't we recognize the changeability of the Swan and say, well, actually, this brain can stay as it is. It's actually not a huge, vast amount of work to get the brain out of the Swan. You don't have to fully disassemble it. There's just a few bits that need to be taken off. And you get the brain out and you can speak to engineering students, design students, and say, look, we've got this Swan's neck. This is the range of movement that it's got capable of doing. This is what it's got in its mouth and what it can do with that. Here's what the brain currently looks like. What do you want it to do? Build us a brain. We'll put it in for 6 months or whatever, and we change the interpretation of what the Swan does. I'm not saying that's definitely the answer, and for a lot of people, that's probably sacrilege, but I think the Swan has a lot of exciting opportunities available to it from that kind of perspective.
Thank you. And Anna, what about you? Where do you envisage the future of the Swan?
Yeah, I think I'd like to echo Dale's comments about the fact that the the heart and the brain is this cam here, and the fact that it's been on a journey and it's been through different ownerships in its time, and it's had, even within the same ownership, it's had repairs carried out which have caused it to behave in a particular way, and after the decisions of people at that time and at that moment, and what's to stop the conversation from changing in the future and allowing further movement to happen. And how we achieve that could be done in a number of ways. It could be done digitally, it could be done by changing out the cam that we have here and putting a new one in. I mean, there are so many ways that this swan could sort of allow interpretation and education to happen. And I think actually this thing is very exciting to look at, and once you start to understand what it does, it teaches you so much about the modern world and how things have developed since this was made. And we think of robotics, but so many normal appliances and engineering has happened sort of from this point. So I think it's a great tool for educating, but if we forget all of that, we have to remember that it's also a spectacular piece, and it's something that we need to keep. You need to keep that spirit alive, and I think what David has said is so true, and I think we could carry on allowing it to sing and to dance, essentially. And I think, the main thing is that we don't forget about it. And I think by doing exercises like this, we are certainly steering it on the right path to a future where we all carry on talking about it and experiencing it. So I think there's no right way forward, but I think the future that we take will be a good future for it. I'm confident of that.
Thank you, Hannah. And finally, Seth, from your perspective, how do you envisage the future of the Swan?
I think, well, from a purely technical standpoint, I suppose, which is where my background is from, technically speaking, we can kind of make it do what we want, as others have described. There are aspects that I think would need to be repaired in order to ensure its longevity, that it can carry on functioning. In the mechanism of it, I think the largest area of caution is probably in the delicacy of the silver neck pieces. So probably there needs to be a conversation about what happens with them, because while we could make it perform wonders or do somersaults or something, perhaps not quite that far. It's the movement of the neck is always going to be a braiding in those silver rings. Again, they could be replaced, but that loses something of its originality. It would. We don't want it to become a static object. It needs to continue to continue functioning, and look beautiful. Hopefully that we can come to a conclusion in some way that we can display it in the magnificent ways that David has been talking about earlier today.
Thank you. And we do have quite a few questions coming in from Zoom now. I'm going to take the last one first, actually. It's from Lucy, and she says, is the swan's articulation of the neck and the fishing action a unique example of this type of automata function in any museum collection? Who would like to? Do we know is it a unique sample or a unique example?
That's a very good question. I think in terms of survivals, there are far fewer, of course. The question of whether it was unique at the time is perhaps harder to answer. I mean, in many ways, it came at the end of a very long period rather than heralding the start of one. The idea of automata, really quite complex automata, going back hundreds of years, I mean, to the ancient world, and then from there through the Islamic world to the West. What's going on underneath the water from my point of view, is fairly straightforward. There's a music playing machine, which is fairly straightforward, a machine for driving the crystal glass twists to simulate the water flow, fairly straightforward. What I think is exceptional, though I suspect not necessarily unique, was the neck mechanism, the neck assembly, which, having seen under its skin and seeing its vertebrae and its nervous system today, it's very easy to see that that is exceptional. I don't know of any very similar ones, certainly in UK collections. I know that there's a sibling of the swan, there's a peacock in the Hermitage Museum in Russia, which I've not visited, so I don't know the similarity there. It may not be unique, but it's certainly exceptional.
May I just very briefly just add to that about, so we have makers and craftspeople here. We know that when you make something for the first time, just to extend David's point, that there's kind of sealing wax and string, and you fix things on and you prototype it essentially. The swan neck is not prototyped, irrespective of the level of craft quality that went into it. There are very few, if hardly any, signs of development. So David's point that maybe at the time this wasn't massively unique, but certainly now it is a unique survivor. And dare I slightly biasedly add that unlike the peacock, of course, the joy of the swan is how closely it mimics life, which, as we know, the people who have seen it here, is absolutely spellbinding.
Thank you, Matthew. Another question, I think it's a question that might be split into two, or at least two of you might answer it. I'm going to put it to Seth, actually, and then perhaps to you again, Matthew. How hard would it be to produce a replica with complete modern technology? Adam Laurie asked that, which you might want to... And my question to you, Matthew, would be why? Why would
well,
you like
exactly. I mean, sorry, is the question using modern technology
how
or
hard would
incorporating?
it be to produce a replica with completely modern technology? I think that one's to Seth. And then the supplementary question, which I'm adding to it, is perhaps to you, Matthew. Why would one want to?
I'm sure modern technology would help in making, in replicating it. There are probably certain elements. I mean, you could draw it all on CAD. You'd be able to CNC lots of bits out. You'd be able to 3D model it on CAD and perfect the shapes of the cams, before you even cut any metal. The delicacy would come in again the silver work, really, in terms of, but there are very capable silversmiths obviously out there that could reproduce those parts. None of it is particularly complex. I mean, one of the trickiest bits would probably be getting fusee chains of the right size to do it, but you can produce all of this stuff in the same way that you do when you're if you're restoring a clock. Whether you would want to and what the benefit would come of that, it's difficult to say.
I think there is, you're absolutely right, Seth. I think there's a broad perception that the skills that were used in the 18th century to make this thing have been lost. They have not been lost. I mean, they may be in slightly different fields and slightly different iterations, but they are out there. We were looking at the silver plumage today with Daniella and Anna. You can get that thing done. I think the important question, you're right, Mark, is why would you want to? And I would, again, reflect back to my previous answer in terms of education and spreading those kind of skills, because they are transferable skills in terms of material manipulation, tools, communication devices, and so on. I've been asked over the past 13 years many times, could you remake a swan? And the problem with some kind of facsimile is that you are using this term very advisedly. You create another monster. You end up with two things that you then have to look after and think about, and you might say, yes, that thing's a prop. We've all seen it in museums, I'm sure, where that prop then gets a life of its own, and you double the trouble, basically. So I would push back on reproduction per se, but absolutely press the gas on building skills, sharing skills in other fields, and to get people jobs and give people a living, essentially.
Thank you, Matthew. And we have another question. I guess this is to everybody, from Jenny, who says, how do you make the Swan accessible to the widest possible audience? I think we can ask Anna first for that.
Good question, and I think it's a very important question, because you do want to sort of get this out to as many people as possible to share it. But how you do that, the vehicle for doing it, I mean, there's a number of ways. Of course, digitization, you can film it, you can then have that medium streamed online, you can have it available to anyone around the world in that way, but do you lose something of its magic by not seeing it in the flesh? So I guess the other way is to have a program, perhaps something that could be considered as a touring program. Of course, you would lose it in its home location here in Bowes, but it would allow this spectacle to go around the world, which I think would be so exciting, because it would give people the opportunity to come and see something for a short period of time, which hopefully would prompt them to see it rather than having it always on display, and the fact that then it's always there and you sort of forget that its existence and its importance. But yeah, I mean, they're two sort of easy and obvious ways of doing it, and I wonder if the panel have any other suggestions.
Dale?
Yeah, so I guess, as Anna says, like, the obvious easy way, like the easiest way, is to record it, which has already been done. There are films on YouTube. So I would say the real bigger question is not necessarily how do you make it accessible to the widest number of people, but how do you make it relevant or exciting to the widest number of people? How do you get them to engage with it? Because looking at a digital version of the Swan is not as exciting as seeing it in the flesh. And so Anna's suggestion about touring is one way, definitely, of doing that, and not to kind of like bang the drum on the same idea, but what I was talking about earlier of potentially getting students involved with modelling different ways of running the Swan or whatever, it causes people to take more ownership of the Swan. It's no longer a thing that they can just go and look at and see, but it can be something that they can program and be like, well, I made the Swan do that. Or, like David said earlier, he just pushing the button for the music box was like an excitement for him to actually, and this is another question in museums all the time coming up about how do we let people handle things and the risk that's associated with that. And like Matthew was saying earlier, conservation is a cost and benefit analysis. What are the costs of letting people handle it? What are the costs of letting people push the button themselves or reprogram it? And what is the potential benefit? And we need to consider that. But yeah, that's what I would kind of say in response to that.
Thanks. And David, do you have some ideas about?
Thanks. Yeah, I should point out that I was carefully trained and supervised in the operation of the button to sound the music, but it was a thrilling experience. I think the point about the physical tour that Anna introduced, I think, is an important one to consider. There can be, in my experience in museums, an inertia, a resistance to going to the trouble of moving fragile, complex machines around the country or the world. One particular example that I was peripherally involved with when I worked at the Science Museum was the locomotive by Robert Stephenson, the rocket locomotive, which has been displayed in London since the 1860s. And a request came in a few years ago from Newcastle, where it was built, to move it to the Discovery Museum in Newcastle, and then to move to Manchester, one end of the Manchester and Liverpool Railway, which is where that kick-started the world of railways, and then to York, the National Railway Museum. And it would have been easy for the Science Museum to say that it was too difficult to do that, because rocket is surprisingly fragile. And yet, seeing the engagement of the people in Newcastle and Manchester and York and all the people around, the friction of the movement of that object, carefully managed in a complex move but possible, brought it alive in ways which it could never have been brought alive if it had remained on display forever in London. And we'll go back to London, and the idea of things going on tours is that they do come home, but they come home enriched, and they've enriched so many other people. So I think there's something to be considered there for a physical tour. But the other idea, which is about how you keep something, how you make something live for people who cannot come and see it in the flesh, the obvious answer is some form of digital facsimile, but I share the panel's view that that can feel underwhelming in a world which is now digital. And this is going to sound very flaky, and I'll keep it short because you want to move on, but the idea of storytelling as a means of keeping ideas alive goes back to the start of time. The idea of passing on stories, folk tales, if you like, from one generation to the next is what keeps ideas alive. And of course they modify and change through time, but nevertheless they're constantly being reperformed. There's ideas around us all over, which are ideas that go back hundreds or thousands of years because the tales have kept being performed. So what are the stories of the Swan that could be performed around the world? What are the songs that could be sung? What are the tales that could be told, the dances, the performances? And I know this sounds flaky, but I think there is something in this which enables the Swan to live everywhere and in everyone without even seeing it in the flesh. And it may have just as much power, vivid power, if that's got right. And I think there's an opportunity for some experiments potentially there.
So, very eloquently put by David. I would also just point out that here at the Bose Museum, we've run quite experimental projects commissioning, as well as the curatorial input that David's described, commissioning artists, for instance, who know nothing about mechanics per se, to respond to a thing. The pianos in the room next to us are a really great example of that, and highly successful. So I would always just throw in there that idea of fresh eyes and fresh ears to a problem or a challenge are really useful, as well as this panel that are pretty familiar with this kind of technology.
I have some questions pre-submitted from the audience, which I'll just address one of these, and then we'll go back to the chat, I think. This is from Ray Morris, who was unfortunately unable to come in this evening. He says, I think it's a question for you, Matthew, actually. I assume that most, if not all, of the Swan that we can see is original, but how much of the internal workings are?
Again, it's an excellent question. Thank you, Mark. How much of the Swan is original? Of course, we could spend the rest of our lives addressing the term original, and let's not do that just now. So in the very broad sense, we believe the head, and the stuff you can see is the head, the neck rings, which we've heard are very fragile, and the body, which we've heard is very robust in relative terms. We have no reason to believe that is not contemporary. That's circa 1770 or whenever the Swan was made. In terms of the mechanism, that's a slightly different story, and it's a mixed bag, to put it one way. The main Swan driving mechanism, the springs and the gears and the levers, I would say thumb in the air, 95, 98%. However, Dale's introductory talk about the multifunction cam, we see, again, don't hold me to this, but maybe 20, 25% of the value of that being changed between, let's say, 1963 and 1973. And of course, change is important because there can be many changes that we never see as an audience, and there can be small changes that have a massive impact on the thing. So I would say, as an overall thumb in the air, it's incredibly well preserved in terms of originality. However, some of the things that have been changed, that small percentage, actually have a big impact on what Swan is from a perception, a viewer's perception.
Thank you, Matthew. And if I may say, if I'm allowed a chair's statement on the notion of authenticity, The philosopher Walter Benjamin said that a medieval Madonna was not original when it was made, but became more authentic later on. And I think, are there any questions from the audience? No, because I'll go back to Zoom. I think we have a kind of general question, which is quite a fun question from Emmanuel, and again addressing all of you, perhaps. What was the most interesting aspect of working on the Swan? Maybe Daniella.
Great question again. Again, not very easy to answer. In terms of the Swan itself, I mean, today's been a pretty fascinating day, especially with this team around me, who've all had their input to enhance what we were looking at. But we were specifically looking at the head this morning, and the way it's made, the craftsmanship, the ingenuity, the movement that it creates, so lifelike and so brilliant, and in some ways so simple when you see it. If you were given the blank piece of paper to try to design this thing, I don't think I would have been able to come up with such simple but such brilliant ideas. So that's been a real treat today. And yeah, there's lots of very tiny parts in the head, a sort of watch type spring and this kind of scissor action which pulls in and out the fish. And it's been really great to have Seth here to sort of dissect that with us with his watchmaking expertise. So I think partly seeing all these things in detail, but also having this team around to really dive into every part in different directions and with different expertise has been a real treat and a pleasure.
And you mentioned Seth, so I'm going to go to Seth and say, what was the most interesting part of the investigations for you?
Well, if I can say two things just to be bring some specifics in. But yeah, as Daniella was saying, that the way that specifically the way that the chains pull the neck and make the neck articulate, that rather than just pulling from one place, there are little hooks on the chains and pins fixed to parts of the neck, so that as the chain is pulled, it catches one pin at one stage, and so rather than it just pulling in a single fashion, it actually pulls in a more lifelike. The angles vary between each of the individual vertebrae of the neck, which is just very simple but really clever. And that's using typical clock style chain of that period. It's not really using anything new technology. The other thing that I found very interesting is dissecting this brain to some extent and trying to work out why and how bits have been changed on it. Why is it not in its original form? Why did someone at some point in the past start altering it? And how is that affecting the interaction of one piece to another? Has the timing been changed between one specific action of the swan and another? So is it still rotating at the same time as the neck's moving? Is it doing that now with this current programming, essentially, because we're almost talking about computer programming in a very primitive sense? Is it still doing those things at the same relative time as it did when it was first put together?
Yeah. And Dale?
Yeah, I think really I would echo exactly what Daniella and Seth have said. The head and neck, whilst on the face of it, you might think, well, that's what it does, the head and neck, but actually you've got this big thing in the middle and everything underneath. But the elegance and relative simplicity, but effectiveness of the head and neck movement when you see the mechanism for that, I mean, that's just, it's just really, really cool. When we took a couple of vertebrae off and looked inside, I was like, that is awesome, So for me, that's definitely been, from a technical standpoint, the most exciting thing about working on the Swan. But also, yeah, having this team of people lots of different perspectives, different conversations, different ideas being kicked around about what the Swan is, what it does, what it could do, how it might be interpreted. It's just a real privilege to be involved in such a broad conversation and to be afforded the time and space to have that conversation.
Yeah. Anna, what have you most enjoyed about?
Thank you. I mean, of course, it's such a privilege to work on an object like this because it's so unusual and unlike, I mean, even though it involves standard elements and bits of clockwork and even bits of watchwork, as we've discovered from the head, it's the fact that it's doing something unlike anything else. And what I love is that's the detective work in trying to decipher what it's doing and translate what you see in front of you and turn that into, oh, well, this actually means that movement, and the opportunity to get your hands onto it and start simulating that movement is just something that is such an incredible privilege. I also really enjoy the fact that you can look at it and try and start to understand what was the person before thinking and why did they do what they did, and how did they overcome the problems that exist. And you know, you see these previous repairs, and sometimes they're quite obvious repairs, and other times it's more subtle, and trying to kind of get inside the head of the people from the past, not just the makers, but the restorers as well. And I just find that kind of really opens up the story of the Swan, and being, you feel like you become part of that as well. So it's just an immense privilege to have that opportunity, and the just starting to understand that mechanism is fascinating. Plus, I should add the silver work. I mean, just having the opportunity to see that craftsmanship and the chasing of those feathers is just, I mean, they're fabulous, really beautiful, beautiful things.
And I think we have time for one more question, perhaps one or two. This is from, my apologies if I pronounce your name incorrectly, Fodor van der Broek, who says, have you found any evidence in the Swan in terms of the building techniques, the construction, I guess, that weren't commonly used in the construction of clocks? And what wear patterns of wear have you found so far that are unique to the Swan and similar to other automata? I guess Matthew.
Thank you, Fodor. We know him well. Thank you, Fodor. Yeah, it's a common question, and it's a great question, and that is one of the questions that the trustees asked me 15 years ago, or whenever it was. How worn is the Swan in terms of wear patterns? There is, regrettably, as we've kind of alluded to, not one simple answer to that. And again, very much thumb in the air, so don't hold me to it. Some parts, like our silver neck rings, are actually broken, so they're 100% worn, if you like. And other parts, strangely, like the internal structure of the neck, because it really only moves in one, it's planar, is incredibly unworn. So you just can't look at it. Well, you can look at it holistically, but inevitably you're drawn into breaking it down into subsections and addressing those. Seth was just talking about the head, which is watch-like and is actually incredibly worn. And I think you've seen new evidence today of that change and repairs and things.
Yeah, there are clearly some bits and pieces that have been changed or altered and modified.
But strangely, in terms of the actual technology of making it, I may change my mind in a minute, but there's nothing new in there. David said earlier that everything below the waterline is pretty much, and this isn't degrading it, of course, but 18th century clockmaking. There are 3 clockwork motors in there. The repoussé silver work is incredibly high quality, but again, it's 18th century work. The one thing I would say is that obviously the design process of the neck and its operation and the twisting, sliding cams is incredible, but actually the neck has got 3 layers, and the inner layer, which is unbelievably, to somebody who's, we've all dealt with a lot of 18th century clockwork, is incredibly modern looking, and it seems that whoever designed the neck, and it's often attributed to John Joseph Merlin, I don't know whether we've actually any hard evidence to support that, but Merlin was certainly around in that workshop at the time. If it was Merlin, then you can feel the whole design and making process going into a completely different gear when you get to the neck. However, getting my conservation soapbox moment, this is why we don't refinish clocks and clockwork mechanisms, because such a lot of evidence of how it was made is in the surface of the thing, which is why we clean very conservatively. Sorry, I had to get that in.
Sorry, just to add something, I've worked on some mid to late 19th century French-made automata, which are more toy-like in some respects in the way that they were designed to be handled, but they were designed with a very short lifespan, and you would equally say that they had clockwork mechanisms in them, but they were very crude clockwork mechanisms, and they weren't designed to be maintained or taken apart. When they would have been worn out, they would have been thrown away, or and that's why there's so few of them left. Whereas when you compare that to this, I mean, this is proper high-end clockwork of the 18th century. It's not clockwork in the crude sense of just being a wind-up spring-driven thing. It's high-quality, work, and that's why it's sort of still in such good condition in so many places.
Thank you. And I think on that note, given that it's just after 7:30, and I think we've been going on, I'd just like to say thank you very much to the panel for all of your fascinating insights into what you've been discovering about the swan. I'd like to say thank you to our seated audience for your patience, and thank you to those at home on your various cameras, and also say thank you to Alison and Darren in the corner for doing all the chat function, and thank you to our film crew as well for dealing so efficiently, even though kind of slightly later than one might imagine, but very efficiently with the technological problems that we had. And just to say that tomorrow there is another event at 10 a.m., isn't it, Alison? Yes, 10 a.m. A similar event that Jane Whittaker is going to be chairing, both on Zoom and also live again. 2 p.m. Thank you. 2 p.m. Thank you. 2 p.m. Yeah, I didn't want to get you up too early, Jane. 2 p.m. Tomorrow for Zoom and live event. But on that note, I'll say thank you very much and good night. Hope you enjoy your rest of your evening.